This is a game between a young Garry Kasparov and Pavlenko, and Kasparov is black here. So let's do a quick evaluation of the board. So you start this with counting pawns. So black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns. And count the pieces. Black has 1, 2, 3, 2 rooks and a bishop, and white has 1 rook and 1 bishop. White is behind by 1 piece, but is up pawns with compensation. And we see potentially passed pawns here, and a passed pawn here. Now let's look at what is already being attacked. We see that the bishops are attacking each other. These pawns are attacking each other here. There's a power move here. If the pawn takes this pawn, it's attacking the queen. We see that the rook can check the king by sacrificing itself here. These are all possibilities. And we also see what pins are at place. And we see that the rook is pinning this bishop here because the queen's behind it. So we might think this bishop can't move. But when you're under attack, you should always consider your counterattacks. Don't get too defensive, and see if you do have a counterattack, because you may have a superior counterattack, a Chicago way counterattack, and that could allow you to gain even more of an advantage. You must also allow your mind to consider sacrifices, and sacrificing your queen as well if it leads to a win. So we can also then, because of that, imagine the bishop, checks in 1 and 2 moves, preparations for checks. So we see that if the bishop captures this bishop, then the rook would be free to capture this pawn. So that would be a 1, 2 check on the king. These are all possibilities and things you should consider when you evaluate the board. You look at all the power moves and preparations for power moves to give you as many options as possible. And if we look at this attack, we see, oh my, the queen now can be captured. But let's continue with this. And we see that when we analyzed previously, we remember we had our 1, 2, and this also contains an attack on the queen. And because it's a check, we have a check here. The king either has to run or the queen has to recapture, which white does here. And the bishop recaptures. And now it's white's turn to move, and the king could capture the bishop, but we see that the white rook is being attacked twice, so he would lose the rook here. So white can capture the rook, and it's check, and the king would recapture, and then the king could capture the bishop. This is one scenario. And now this passed pawn becomes an issue. These 2 passed pawns become the main focus of the game in the way that the pieces were traded in this scenario. And now it's black's turn to move. In endings like this, when there are only kings, you need to actually just count how many moves it takes for the king to move to capture pawns or to prevent pawns from becoming queens. So now it's a race to see who can get a passed pawn that can become a queen. So pause the video and count how many moves it takes for the king to move in for a defense or find a way to promote a pawn to a queen. So pause the video. Okay, we see that this pawn only has 2 moves, 1, 2 to become a queen, and this pawn 1, 2, 3 to become a queen here. But it's black to move here, and the king can capture this pawn in 3 moves, 1, 2, 3. It is black to move here, and we can, let's say, push this pawn here. And if you looked at this scenario, you could see that the king can move over for defense. And if the pawn moves up 1 more, the king can slide over and win this pawn and prevent it from becoming a queen. So that plan doesn't give black an advantage. So let's back up here and look at other possibilities. There were two ways for this black pawn to try and reach the other side of the board, and the other one was to simply capture this, winning a pawn in the process. And now the pawn is one square away from the king, and the king doesn't really have time to stop this pawn now from queening. And with that would be the end of the game. But let's back up and see what actually happened in the game. White saw this move that he would lose if he allowed all the trades to take place, so he moves the rook over, and now the pawn does capture anyway. The rook slides back to try and defend to keep this pawn from queening, and the pawn pushes, attacking the queen. Attacking the rook. The rook slides over, and now do you see a defense for the pawn and the bishop? So the bishop runs and defends the pawn, and now the game is over. Black can easily win. He's up 2 pieces. He can wipe out these pawns, and white did resign here. So if we back up and look at the original position here, we see that the potential of this passed pawn really was the whole point of the game, power move number 6, which underscores the importance of passed pawns and how they can control games. And it's because black had the 1-2 combination that allowed, he had the check first with check. Had white had the check first, then this combination wouldn't work. So always look for 1-2 combinations, and you can find winning paths in your games.